The wedding of the season was meant to erase a mistake. For the Duchess of Blackwood, it was not a celebration of love, but a declaration of victory, proof that bloodlines, titles, and obedience always triumphed over sentiment. Every detail had been arranged with ruthless precision: the chapel, the alliance, the bride of perfect pedigree, and the final cruelty. An invitation sent to the woman her son had been forced to abandon. The Duchess wanted a witness. She wanted the disgraced governess to sit quietly at the back of the chapel and watch the Duke married properly at last, to see how thoroughly she had been replaced. What the Duchess did not expect was to invite the very truth she had spent 4 years burying. Because when the chapel doors opened, the former lover did not arrive alone. She arrived holding the hands of 2 little boys who carried the Duke's face and a secret powerful enough to turn whispered gossip into scandal, champagne into poison, and a noble family's legacy into ruin. This is the story of how a proud duchess tried to humiliate a forgotten woman, and instead destroyed her own house. For years earlier, Mary Ellison had loved a man she was never meant to touch. Arthur Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood, was heir to one of England's oldest titles, and she was merely the daughter of a country clergyman, educated, capable, and invisible to society's rules. Their love had been quiet, dangerous, and deeply real. It ended the night his mother intervened. The Duchess of Blackwood had made her position clear: abandon the girl, or be disinherited and erased. Arthur broke Mary's heart with trembling hands, believing as his mother assured him that the matter was settled forever. What no one in Blackwood House knew was that Mary was already carrying his children. She wrote. She pleaded. She waited. Every letter was intercepted. Every attempt silenced. And when the twins were born, Mary vanished from polite society, not in shame, but in survival. She raised her sons alone. Until the day an ivory invitation arrived, sealed in gold, bearing the names of the Duke and his new bride. And with it, a single cruel message from the Duchess herself. That invitation was meant to reopen old wounds. Instead, it reopened a war. Mary had survived 4 years of mornings when bread was too expensive and winters when the cold made her son's lips turn blue. She had survived the weight of teaching other people's children while her own asked questions she couldn't answer. She had survived the Duchess's greatest weapon, erasure. But the invitation changed everything. Because the Duchess hadn't just invited Mary to witness her replacement. She had reminded Mary that she still existed. And existing after being told you were nothing was the most dangerous thing a forgotten woman could do. If you've ever been told your voice doesn't matter, if you've ever been erased, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, this story is yours. Mary didn't fight with tears. She didn't fight with rage. She fought with the one thing the Duchess never expected: the truth she'd spent 4 years trying to bury. This isn't just a Victorian romance. It's a reckoning. Stay with me, because what happens next is for everyone who's ever been told to disappear quietly. Mary Ellison learned very early that there were 2 kinds of silence. There was the gentle silence of early mornings in the countryside, when dew clung to the hedgerows and the world felt briefly forgiving. And then there was the silence that followed disgrace, sharp, deliberate, imposed. It was the second kind that swallowed her whole the night Arthur Blackwood left. They had been sitting in the small parlor of her rented rooms near Bloomsbury, the fire reduced to glowing embers, the rain tapping steadily against the windows like an impatient witness. Arthur had removed his gloves 3 times and put them back on again, as though unsure what version of himself he was permitted to be. He had not met her eyes when he spoke. "My mother has given me no choice," he said at last, his voice strained and brittle. She says affection is not enough. That a duke must think beyond himself. Mary had known this moment would come. She had lived beneath its shadow since the first time Arthur kissed her tenderly, reverently in the gardens of Blackwood House, a place she was never meant to enter as anything but staff. Still, knowing did not soften the blow. "She will disinherit you," Mary said quietly. It was not a question. Arthur nodded. "She will ruin you if I refuse. She has already begun asking questions. Making inquiries. Mary, she calls this a kindness." Mary smiled then, not because she found humor in it, but because pride was the last thing she had left. She stood, crossed the room, and opened the door herself. "Then you must go," she said. "Before you convince yourself this is mercy." Arthur had hesitated only a second too long. It was enough. 3 weeks later, the sickness began. At first, Mary told herself it was grief, sleeplessness, shock. But when the dizziness worsened and the nausea refused to pass, she visited a physician with dread curling in her stomach like smoke. The confirmation arrived without ceremony. She was with child. She wrote to Arthur that same evening. She wrote again the next day. And the day after that. Each letter was returned unopened. The 4th time, the envelope bore a crimson stamp she would never forget. Return to sender. When she called Blackwood House directly, the voice that answered was not Arthur's. It was his mother's. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood did not raise her voice. She did not threaten loudly. She did not need to. "You will cease this behavior at once," the Duchess said coolly, as though correcting a servant who had misplaced silverware. "My son has moved on. He will not be burdened by hysterics or opportunism." "I am carrying his child," Mary said, her hand trembling around the receiver. There was a pause. Then laughter. "You will carry nothing that concerns us," Lady Elizabeth replied. It was the kind of cruelty only the aristocracy could deliver, wrapped in silk, delivered with a smile, and utterly final. "If you attempt to contact him again, I will ensure you never find employment in this city. I will ensure you are ruined so thoroughly you will beg for obscurity." The line went dead. That was the day Mary understood something essential about power. It did not shout. It erased. She left London within the month. Bath, Somerset was quieter. Smaller. Less cruel. There, Mary found work as a governess to a widower's daughter's modest pay, long hours, and rooms barely large enough to breathe in. But it was honest work. And when the twins were born on a gray autumn morning, Mary did not cry from shame. She cried from relief. William arrived first, red-faced and furious at the world. John followed moments later, calmer, his fingers curling instinctively around hers as though he already understood what survival required. They were perfect. And they were hers. The years that followed were not gentle ones. Mary rose before dawn, taught children who were not her own, studied by candlelight after her sons slept, and learned to stretch pennies until they screamed. There were winters when the cold bit through the walls and summers when hunger made her lightheaded. But there was also laughter. The twins learned to walk holding on to chair legs. They learned letters before most children their age. They argued fiercely and defended one another with equal ferocity. They asked questions Mary sometimes could not answer. "Where is our father?" John asked once, his brow furrowed. Mary had knelt to their height and spoken carefully. He is a man who made a choice, she said. And choices have consequences. She never spoke Arthur's name aloud. Not because she hated him but because hatred still gave him space in her heart, and she could not afford that. By the time the invitation arrived 4 years later, Mary was no longer the frightened young woman Lady Elizabeth remembered. She was educated, resilient, dangerous in the quiet way that comes from having nothing left to lose. She reread the Duchess's note only once before burning it. The children watched the flame consume the paper with fascination. "Are we going somewhere?" William asked. "Yes," Mary said, folding the invitation itself neatly into her reticule. "We are going to London." "Is it dangerous?" John asked, perceptive as ever. Mary met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "But we will be together." On the journey to the city, Mary studied her son's reflections in the carriage window. There was no denying the truth written plainly in their features. The Blackwood blood Lady Elizabeth prized so dearly lived and breathed in the boy she had tried to erase. Mary felt no desire for revenge. But she did feel something colder. Justice. If Lady Elizabeth wanted a witness to her triumph, Mary would grant her one. She would not beg. She would not shout. She would simply stand where the truth could no longer be ignored and let the silence do the rest. St. George's Chapel had not witnessed such a gathering in over a generation. Carriages lined the square from dawn, lacquered black and gleaming beneath the pale London sun, their crests polished to brilliance. Footmen in livery leapt down to open doors, offering gloved hands to ladies weighed down by silks, satins, and jewels heavy with inheritance. Titles drifted through the air like perfume earls, viscounts, baronesses, each name a quiet assertion of relevance. This was not merely a wedding. It was a display. Inside the chapel, every inch had been transformed to suit Lady Elizabeth Blackwood's vision. White roses cascaded down marble columns. Ivory runners softened the echo of footsteps on ancient stone. Candles flickered beneath stained glass saints who looked down in mute judgment upon the living. At the front of the nave, beneath a soaring arch, stood Arthur Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood. He was impeccable. His coat was cut perfectly to his frame, black wool trimmed with understated elegance. His gloves were pristine. His posture straight. To the assembled guests, he looked every inch the man born to command estates and lineage alike. Only those who knew him well, and few truly did, would have noticed the stillness in his expression. The absence. His smile appeared when required. He inclined his head at the appropriate moments. He accepted congratulations with a practiced grace learned at his mother's knee. But his eyes were distant, as though fixed on something beyond the chapel walls. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood observed her son from the front pew, satisfaction curling through her like warmth. She wore silver silk, woven so finely it caught the light with every breath she took. Diamonds rested at her throat, heirlooms passed down through generations of women who understood the power of control and never apologized for it. Today, everything was as it should be. She leaned toward her companion, Lady Harrington, her voice low and amused. "He looks the part, does he not? One would almost think he believed in it." Lady Harrington chuckled behind her fan. "And the bride? I hear her dowry is substantial." "Appropriately so," Lady Elizabeth replied. "Marriage is an alliance, not a fairy tale." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the rear pews, the ones she had deliberately arranged to remain conspicuously empty. Reserved for Mary Ellison. The thought pleased her more than the champagne she sipped delicately from crystal. Let the girl sit there and see what obedience earns security, position, legacy. Let her understand what she had never been fit to claim. Behind the chapel doors, Miss Catherine Moore stood waiting, her hands clasped tightly before her as her maid adjusted the fall of her veil. She was beautiful in the way society rewarded tall, pale, flawless, her expression carefully schooled into serenity. But beneath the lace and pearls, unease stirred. She had noticed Arthur's distance. She had noticed Lady Elizabeth's grip. And though she had been raised to accept such arrangements without protest, something about today felt less like a beginning and more like a conclusion. The string quartet began to play. A hush fell over the congregation. Lady Elizabeth straightened, lifting her chin imperceptibly. This was the moment. At the back of the chapel, the great doors stood closed, their dark oak polished to a mirror sheen. Mary Ellison arrived precisely then. She paused on the threshold, her sons at her side, their small hands warm in hers. The chapel loomed before them cavernous, glittering, intimidating. William craned his neck. "Mama," he whispered. "Is this a church or a palace?" Mary smiled faintly. "Both, my love." John studied the people inside with quiet intensity. "They look important." "They think they are," Mary replied gently. She smoothed her gloves, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath. She did not tremble. Fear had exhausted itself long ago. The doors began to open. Slowly. Heavily. The sound echoed through the chapel like thunder. Conversation faltered. Heads turned. A ripple of confusion passed through the back rows, spreading forward as recognition failed to form. This was no late aristocrat sneaking in unnoticed. This was a procession. Mary stepped forward into the light not as a ghost the Duchess thought she'd buried, but as a woman who had survived erasure and returned with living proof. Her gown was deep emerald velvet, rich and restrained, the cut elegant rather than ostentatious. Her hair was swept up, revealing a calm face untouched by desperation or shame. And at her side walked two boys. Identical. Poised. Unmistakable. The resemblance struck like a physical blow. Murmurs rose, sharp and startled. Lady Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. She turned. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor with a sound far too loud in the sudden silence. Arthur heard it. He looked up. And the world tilted. For a moment, he did not understand what he was seeing. His mind rejected the image outright. Mary, standing where she should not be, looking stronger than memory allowed. Then his gaze dropped. The boys. The same eyes. The same line of jaw he had inherited from his father, and his father before him. His breath left him in a single, broken exhale. Someone whispered his name. Another voice gasped. Miss Catherine Moore turned, confusion blooming into horror. Mary walked forward, unhurried, her steps measured and deliberate, down the center aisle meant for brides. She did not look at the guests. She looked straight ahead. Toward Lady Elizabeth. Toward Arthur. Toward the truth no one could stop now. For a heartbeat, no one moved. St. George's Chapel filled moments before with the soft rustle of silk and the murmured confidence of privilege seemed to hold its breath. Even the string quartet faltered, bows hovering uncertainly over strings before the music dissolved into nothing. Mary Ellison stood at the center aisle, sunlight streaming through stained glass behind her, casting fractured colors across the stone floor. The boys at her sides tightened their grips on her hands, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Every eye in the chapel was fixed upon them. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood was the first to recover. She rose so abruptly from her seat that her chair scraped loudly against the stone, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. Her face had gone pale beneath its careful rouge, her lips pressed thin, as though sheer will might compress the moment into something manageable. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her voice ringing out clipped, imperious, and trembling despite itself. "You will remove yourself at once." Mary did not flinch. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of courtesy that only sharpened the insult. "You invited me, Your Grace." A murmur rippled through the guests. Lady Elizabeth lifted her chin. "To observe. Not to disrupt." "And yet," Mary replied evenly, "you chose the place, the day, and the audience." "I merely honored the invitation." Arthur had not moved. He stood frozen at the altar, his hands clenched at his sides, his pulse roaring in his ears. His gaze flicked from Mary to the boys and back again, his breath shallow and uneven. He knew. Some part of him had always known. He took a step forward without realizing it. "Mary," he said hoarsely. The sound of his voice drew the boys' attention. William studied him openly, head tilted in curiosity, while John's expression was more guarded, his fingers tightening reflexively around Mary's hand. Miss Catherine More emerged then from the side chapel, her veil half lifted, confusion etched plainly across her delicate features. She took in the scene, the halted ceremony, the shattered glass, the strangers at the aisle, and her eyes widened. "Arthur," she whispered. "What is happening?" Before he could answer, Mary spoke again. "I believe introductions are in order," she said softly, her voice carrying with remarkable clarity. "You see, Your Grace," her eyes never left Lady Elizabeth, "it would be discourteous to arrive with family unannounced." She rested a gentle hand on William's shoulder. "These are my sons," Mary said. The word sons echoed. Arthur's knees buckled. He fell forward, the motion uncontrolled, the polished dignity of the Duke shattering as he dropped to one knee before the boys. Gasps erupted around them, shock layered upon shock. "William," Mary continued calmly. "John." She drew a breath. "And this," she said, meeting Arthur's eyes at last, "is their father." The chapel erupted. Whispers surged like wildfire, overlapping and uncontrolled. Fans snapped open. Heads bent together urgently. Somewhere near the back, someone began to cry. Lady Elizabeth staggered. "No," she said sharply. "No, this is absurd. This woman is attempting extortion. She has brought impostors into a sacred place." She turned toward the footmen at the side doors. "Remove them." Mary's hand slipped into her reticule. She withdrew a folded packet of documents worn at the edges, carefully preserved. She held them up, not toward Lady Elizabeth, but toward the officiant and the assembled witnesses. "Birth records," she said calmly. "Baptismal certificates. Correspondence returned unopened. And a sworn statement from my physician." Lady Elizabeth's composure fractured. "You dare," she hissed. "You dare stand there and accuse." "I accuse nothing," Mary interrupted gently. "I present facts." She turned to Arthur, whose face had gone ashen. "I wrote to you," she said, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating truth. "I called. I waited. Every attempt was intercepted. Arthur shook his head, his breath hitching. I never received them. I know, Mary said quietly. Your mother did. The Duchess's mask shattered completely. You ungrateful wretch, Lady Elizabeth spat. After all I sacrificed for you. Arthur rose slowly to his feet. The chapel watched in stunned silence as the Duke of Blackwood turned to face his mother, not as a son seeking approval, but as a man confronting betrayal. You knew, he said. Lady Elizabeth opened her mouth. You knew, he repeated, his voice breaking. You knew she was with child. I protected you, Lady Elizabeth snapped. I saved you from ruin. You stole 4 years of my life, Arthur said hoarsely. And theirs. The Blackwood blood his mother prized above all else, staring back at him from the faces of sons she'd tried to erase. Miss Catherine More stepped back, her face drained of color. This marriage, she said faintly, what is it, then? Lady Elizabeth rounded on her. A necessity. Catherine looked at Arthur at his shaking hands, his shattered expression, his eyes fixed on 2 children he had never known, and then at Mary, standing unbowed in the center aisle. I will not be a solution to someone else's cruelty, she said quietly. She lifted her veil and laid it gently upon the nearest pew. I believe the ceremony is concluded. With that, she turned and walked away. The sound of her retreat echoed louder than any applause. Arthur sank back down, this time deliberately, his voice cracking as he looked up at Mary. I did not abandon you, he whispered. I swear to you. I know, Mary said softly. But you did not fight. William tugged at her sleeve. Mama? Yes, love? Is he the bad man? Mary knelt, meeting her son's eyes. No, she said. He is simply a man who let someone else decide his courage. She rose, her posture straight once more. Lady Elizabeth watched helplessly as her narrative collapsed around her. Mary turned toward the doors, her sons at her sides. We have stayed long enough, she said calmly. Come, boys. As she walked away, the crowd parted instinctively, unwilling to touch the truth she carried. Arthur remained kneeling. Lady Elizabeth stood frozen. And St. George's Chapel ancient, unmoved by titles, bore silent witness to the moment a lie died in daylight. That silence in the chapel? You felt it, didn't you? The moment when a woman who was supposed to stay buried, stood exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. This is the scene we've all been waiting for when someone who was erased refuses to disappear. But here's the truth, the Duchess isn't done. Not even close. If you've ever wanted to watch someone who silenced you finally lose their power, don't stop now. Because Mary's about to teach the world what happens when you corner someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The chapel did not erupt all at once. It fractured. Sound returned in uneven waves, a hiss of whispers, the scrape of shoes against stone, the frantic flutter of fans snapping open and shut. Nobles leaned together, voices low and sharp, every syllable weighted with speculation. A wedding that had promised alliance and legacy now promised something far more delicious to society's appetite: scandal. Mary felt it at her back as she walked away, the heat of attention, the hum of judgment, but she did not quicken her pace. Her sons walked steadily beside her, small shoulders squared, their heads held high as though they instinctively understood that dignity mattered most when eyes burned brightest. Behind them, Lady Elizabeth Blackwood found her voice again. This ceremony is adjourned, she declared sharply, turning on the officiant. You will clear the chapel at once. No one is to speak of what has occurred here today. The officiant hesitated, looking uncertainly between the Duchess and the Duke still kneeling at the altar. Arthur rose slowly. No, he said. The word landed with more force than a shout. Lady Elizabeth turned, disbelief etched across her features. Excuse me? Arthur's face was pale, but his voice was steady, now steadier than it had ever been in his mother's presence. You will not command this room, he said. Not today. A ripple of shock passed through the guests. Lady Elizabeth laughed a brittle, disbelieving sound. You are overwhelmed. Confused. Sit down before you humiliate yourself further. I believe that privilege has already been claimed, Arthur replied quietly. He stepped down from the altar and moved toward Mary. She stopped only when he stood before her, his eyes searching her face as though afraid she might vanish if he blinked. I didn't know, he said again, desperation threading through the words. I swear it. She controlled my correspondence. She told me you had gone abroad. That you were well. That you wished no further contact. I know what she told you, Mary said calmly. She told me what she wished me to believe as well. Lady Elizabeth advanced, her composure cracking with every step. You are embarrassing yourself, Arthur. This woman is manipulating you. She waited until today because she knows the value of spectacle. Mary turned then, fully, and faced the Duchess at last. No, she said softly. I waited because this was the day you chose to remind me of what you thought I was worth. A hush fell again, tighter now, more dangerous. You sent the invitation, Mary continued, her voice even. You reserved a seat for me at the back, so I might observe my replacement. You wanted me to feel small. She looked around the chapel, meeting the eyes of peers and power brokers alike. I simply declined to arrive alone. Lady Elizabeth's lips trembled. You will regret this, she hissed. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Mary's mouth curved in the faintest smile. On the contrary, Your Grace. I lived with it for 4 years. Arthur looked between them, realization dawning fully now. You blocked her letters, he said slowly. Didn't you? Lady Elizabeth straightened. I protected this family. You lied, Arthur said. You stole. The word struck harder than any accusation Mary could have offered. Miss Catherine More reappeared at the edge of the aisle, her expression resolute. My father will hear of this, she said, not to threaten, but to warn. And so will his solicitors. Lady Elizabeth waved her off dismissively. This marriage is still salvageable. Catherine shook her head. No. It never was. She turned to Mary, her gaze steady. I am sorry. Then she walked past Lady Elizabeth without another glance. The murmurs swelled into open conversation. Names were repeated. Calculations made. Alliances quietly reconsidered. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else began already to narrate the story that would be told in drawing rooms by nightfall. Lady Elizabeth felt the room turning against her. She snapped her fingers at a footman. Summon the carriages. Now. But no one moved. The staff watched Arthur, not her. Arthur exhaled slowly. The wedding is cancelled, he said. Gasps. Lady Elizabeth stared at him, her face twisting with rage. You will ruin us. You already did, Arthur replied. He looked down at the boys, who regarded him with solemn curiosity. "I cannot undo what was taken from them," he said quietly. "But I will not compound it." William studied him for a long moment. "You cry," he observed. Arthur swallowed. "Yes." John stepped slightly closer to Mary. "Mama says crying is allowed." A few guests looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. Lady Elizabeth's control slipped entirely. "Get them out," she snapped. "I will not have my house disgraced by bastards and hysterics." The word cracked through the chapel like a whip. Mary did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Choose your next words carefully," she said softly. "Every ear in this room is listening." The Duchess realized too late that the balance had shifted. Mary turned away. "Come, boys." She led them down the aisle once more, not as an intruder now, but as the axis around which the day had turned. The doors closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the chapel. Outside, the air felt sharper, colder, alive. Carriages waited. Footmen stared. News already spread. Mary lifted her sons into the waiting hired coach herself. As the carriage pulled away, she did not look back. Inside the chapel, Lady Elizabeth Blackwood stood amid white roses and broken illusions, realizing that humiliation had only been the opening move. And that she would not accept defeat quietly. The carriage had not yet cleared the chapel gates when Lady Elizabeth Blackwood began to plan her retaliation. She did not collapse. She did not scream, not at first. She stood amid wilted roses and abandoned pews, her spine rigid, her expression carved into something cold and precise. The guests drifted away in clusters, their whispers no longer cautious, their glances no longer respectful. Some offered stiff nods of sympathy. Others barely concealed their satisfaction. Lady Elizabeth noticed everything. And she catalogued it all. By the time the last carriage departed, she had already decided on her narrative. Inside Blackwood House, Mayfair, the servants sensed the shift immediately. Doors closed more quietly. Footsteps softened. No one met the Duchess's eyes. Even the great halls, usually echoing with deference, seemed to recoil from her presence. Arthur followed her into the drawing-room, his jaw tight, his mind still reeling. "You knew," he said again, as though repetition might make it comprehensible. "You knew she was carrying my children." Lady Elizabeth poured herself a glass of brandy, her hand steady. "I knew she was inconvenient." "You threatened her," he said. "You intercepted her letters." "I preserved your future," she replied calmly. "And I will do so again." Arthur stared at her. "By destroying mine?" She turned at last, her gaze sharp as cut glass. "Do not be melodramatic. You will thank me once this unpleasantness is resolved." "Resolved how?" Lady Elizabeth smiled not warmly, but confidently. "By removing her leverage." The word struck him with sudden clarity. "You mean the boys?" Lady Elizabeth did not deny it. "They are Blackwood's," she said. "Whether she likes it or not. And I will not have them raised in obscurity by a woman who weaponizes sentiment." Arthur felt something in him break. "You will not touch them," he said. Lady Elizabeth's smile thinned. "You forget yourself." "No," Arthur replied quietly. "I remember myself." He left the room then, not storming, not shouting, but with a finality that unsettled her more than defiance ever had. That evening, Mary Ellison received her first letter. It was delivered by a uniformed courier, sealed with an unfamiliar crest. She recognized the paper at once: heavy, expensive, intended to intimidate. She read it once. Then again. Her hands did not shake. Notice of petition for custodial review, it read. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood, formally requested an inquiry into the welfare, guardianship, and suitability of Mary Ellison as sole custodian to William and John Ellison. The grounds were listed with clinical precision. Questionable moral history, lack of financial stability, emotional manipulation, deliberate alienation from paternal lineage. Mary folded the letter slowly. So this was how Lady Elizabeth chose to fight. Not with shame. With law. Within days, the rumors followed. That Mary had deliberately hidden the children to secure advantage. That she was unstable, overly proud, unwilling to allow the boys access to their heritage. That she had staged the wedding interruption for attention. Whispers crept through Bath, Somerset, slithering into markets and schoolyards alike. Some neighbors grew distant. Others grew curious. Mary responded by doing the only thing she trusted. She prepared. Her evenings became meticulous rituals of study and strategy. Documents were retrieved. Letters preserved. Witnesses identified. Every returned envelope was evidence. Every dated note a thread in the tapestry Lady Elizabeth had woven too carelessly. Arthur wrote to her once. Then again. She did not reply. Not because she hated him, but because she refused to let confusion blur her purpose. The boys sensed the tension immediately. Are we in trouble? William asked one evening as Mary tucked him into bed. No, Mary said softly. We are being tested. John watched her closely. By the angry lady. Yes, Mary admitted. By her. Will she take us? William whispered. Mary knelt beside them, her voice firm and unwavering. No one takes what does not belong to them. In London, Lady Elizabeth worked tirelessly. Judges were contacted. Old favors invoked. Letters written in ink sharp with entitlement. She dressed more modestly now, presenting herself as a grieving grandmother, wounded, misunderstood, devoted. The narrative shifted subtly. Not everyone believed her. But enough did. Arthur received notice of the petition on the third day. He confronted her immediately. You are escalating, he said. You are endangering them. They are already endangered, Lady Elizabeth replied coolly. By a woman who does not understand the weight of legacy. You are not saving them, Arthur said. You are punishing her. Lady Elizabeth's composure cracked just slightly. She humiliated me. Arthur stared at her. That, he said quietly, is the most honest thing you've said. The court date was set. And with it came a realization Mary could not ignore. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood was not seeking reconciliation. She was seeking control. And she would not stop until someone stopped her. The courtroom at the Old Bailey smelled of ink, old wood, and restraint. Sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting pale bands across the polished floor where generations of disputes had been measured and judged. The benches were filled well before the appointed hour, not merely with clerks and solicitors, but with observers drawn by curiosity and calculation. A Blackwood scandal was a spectacle no one wished to miss. Mary Ellison entered quietly. She wore a simple dark gown, unadorned save for a brooch at her throat, her mother's, modest and unassuming. There was no attempt at display. Her hair was neatly arranged, her posture composed. To those who understood power, it was a dangerous look, restraint worn like armor. William and John were not present. Mary had insisted upon it. This battle would not be fought with their faces. At the front of the chamber, Lady Elizabeth Blackwood sat beside her counsel, dressed in sober black, her jewels minimal, her expression carefully sorrowful. She held a handkerchief in one gloved hand, already prepared. Those who did not know her well might have mistaken her for a woman wounded by circumstance rather than one orchestrating it. Arthur arrived last. He did not sit beside his mother. The space between them was as deliberate as a verdict. The magistrate, Justice Henry Collins, entered with brisk efficiency, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced intolerance for nonsense. "Proceed," he said. Lady Elizabeth's counsel rose first, a tall man with silver hair and a voice honed to suggest reason even when delivering cruelty. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today out of grave concern for the welfare of two minor children, heirs to a significant estate, who have been concealed from their rightful family for 4 years." Mary felt the words like grit between her teeth. The counsel continued smoothly. "My client, the Duchess of Blackwood, was denied knowledge of these children. She seeks only to ensure their proper upbringing, education, and security, things she is uniquely positioned to provide." There it was. Legacy disguised as concern. He turned toward Mary. "Miss Ellison has demonstrated a troubling pattern of secrecy, emotional manipulation, and alienation." Mary stood when called. She did not rush. She did not bow. She faced the court squarely. "I concealed nothing," she said calmly. "I was prevented from disclosure." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Lady Elizabeth dabbed delicately at her eyes. Justice Collins raised a brow. "Explain." Mary produced the bundle she had assembled with care. "These," she said, placing them before the bench, "are letters written to the Duke of Blackwood over the course of 6 months following our separation. All were returned unopened." She held up the crimson-stamped envelopes. "Here are records of telephone calls placed to Blackwood House. Here are witness statements from the postal clerk who handled the correspondence. And here," she paused, letting the moment breathe, "is the testimony of Lady Elizabeth Blackwood herself, acknowledging that she intercepted communications she deemed inconvenient." Lady Elizabeth stiffened. "That is taken out of context," her counsel snapped. "Context does not change authorship," Mary replied evenly. Justice Collins studied the documents, his expression tightening. "And your financial means?" the counsel pressed. "Is it not true you live modestly?" "Yes," Mary said. "It is. And is that not evidence you cannot provide adequately for 2 children of noble birth?" Mary met his gaze without flinching. "It is evidence only that I value sufficiency over excess." A ripple of subdued approval passed through the benches. Arthur was called next. Lady Elizabeth watched him with sharp intensity as he took the stand. "Mr. Blackwood," the counsel began. "Did you know of these children prior to the wedding?" "No," Arthur said clearly. "And had you known?" He paused. "I would not have stood at that altar." The room exhaled as one. "And do you believe your mother to be acting in their best interest?" Arthur turned then, looking not at the bench, but at Lady Elizabeth. He saw the woman who had shaped him with fear disguised as love. "No," he said. Lady Elizabeth's breath hitched audibly. She seeks control, Arthur continued. Not custody. She views people as assets. I was one. These boys would be the same. Lady Elizabeth surged to her feet. How dare you? Justice Collins struck the bench sharply. You will sit. Silence followed thick, condemning. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood, he said slowly, this court does not reward pedigree over care. He turned to Mary. You have demonstrated consistent guardianship, reasonable conduct, and credible obstruction by a third party. Then back to Lady Elizabeth. Your petition for custodial review is denied. The gavel fell. Once. Final. Lady Elizabeth's face drained of color. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, based on the evidence of interference and intimidation, I am issuing a restraining order. You are to have no unsupervised contact with the children pending further review. The room erupted in restrained shock. Lady Elizabeth stood rigid, the handkerchief forgotten in her lap. Lady Elizabeth did not move. In 50 years, no one had ever told her no. She had forgotten what the word sounded like when spoken to her face. Arthur closed his eyes. Mary exhaled not in triumph, but in release. As the court adjourned, the Duchess remained seated, her world recalibrating around a truth she had never believed possible. That authority could be refused. And power, finally, could answer to consequence. This moment? This is for every woman who was told she'd never win. For every mother who fought an unfair system. For every person dismissed because they didn't have the right name, the right title, the right everything. Mary didn't have power. She didn't have wealth. She didn't have a duke at her side. What she had was 4 years of returned letters. 4 years of proof. 4 years of being right. If you've ever had to face someone who thought they were untouchable, keep watching. Because Lady Elizabeth still thinks this is a battle she can win. And she's about to learn what Victorian society feared most, a woman with nothing left to fear. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood had never understood retreat. To her, withdrawal was weakness, an admission that one lacked the will to dominate. For 50 years she had ruled drawing rooms, estates, and board tables with the same unwavering principle: if resistance appeared, apply more pressure. The court's ruling did not humble her. It enraged her. She returned to Blackwood House, Mayfair, that afternoon in silence, her carriage wheels grinding against the gravel as though they resented the task. Servants opened doors and stepped aside, eyes lowered. No one spoke. No one offered tea. In the long gallery, portraits of ancestors stared down at her, men and women whose legacies she had guarded with ruthless devotion. She stopped before the largest frame, her late husband rendered in oils, his expression stern and approving. I will not be undone, she said aloud. The restraining order was an inconvenience. A delay. Nothing more. Lady Elizabeth had survived worse. Within hours, she had summoned her solicitor, her banker, and 2 men whose names never appeared on paper. Letters were drafted. Payments authorized. Conversations held behind closed doors where truth was unnecessary and loyalty could be purchased. If she could not reach the children directly, she would reshape the world around them. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That week, the annual Blackwood Benefactors Assembly approached a gathering of investors, titled allies, and patrons held in the grand ballroom of Blackwood House. It was tradition. Attendance was expected. Absence was noted. Lady Elizabeth decided to proceed. The scandal would be buried beneath chandeliers and champagne. She would remind them all who she was. Arthur learned of the event the night before. "You must not attend," he told her over the telephone, his voice tight with warning. "They are watching you." "They have always watched me," Lady Elizabeth replied coolly. "And they have always obeyed. You are courting disaster." Lady Elizabeth smiled into the receiver. "I built disaster-proof walls long before you were born." Mary heard of the assembly through a different channel. A sealed note arrived that evening, delivered by hand. It bore no crest. Inside was a single sentence. "She is not finished." The note was unsigned. Mary read it twice, then once more. Her pulse quickened not with fear, but with clarity. She had expected this. Power does not relinquish itself quietly. She went to Arthur that night. They sat across from one another at a small table in his temporary lodgings, modest rooms he had taken deliberately, far from his mother's influence. "She will try something," Mary said. "She already has," Arthur replied. "My accounts have been frozen. My access revoked. She is bleeding the estate to remind me of my place." Mary nodded. "Then she is desperate." Arthur looked up sharply. "Desperation makes people reckless." He leaned forward. "I know her patterns. When she feels threatened, she performs." Mary's eyes narrowed. "A stage," she said softly. "Yes. The benefactors' assembly." 2 days later, Blackwood House, Mayfair glittered once more. Candles blazed. Music swelled. Silk and velvet filled the ballroom as if scandal had never crossed its threshold. Lady Elizabeth descended the staircase in gold brocade, her posture immaculate, her expression serene. She stood beneath the chandelier and raised her glass. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying easily. "Recent events have given rise to unfortunate rumors. I assure you, the stability of Blackwood Holdings remains unquestionable." A ripple of polite applause followed. Mary watched from the back of the room. She had not been invited. She had come anyway. Beside her stood Arthur, no longer a duke performing obedience, but a man standing deliberately where he chose. Lady Elizabeth continued, her confidence growing. "We are, as ever, a family built on legacy, foresight, and—" The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the massive screen behind her, usually reserved for philanthropic tallies, illuminated. Not with figures. With letters. Projected large enough for the entire room to read. Correspondence letters in Mary's handwriting, begging to be heard. Bank transfers, payments to silence witnesses. Private instructions in Lady Elizabeth's own hand, ordering her son's mail destroyed and Mary's name erased from every record. A hush fell over the assembly. Lady Elizabeth turned slowly. "What is this?" she demanded. Arthur's voice carried from the back. "This," he said clearly, "is the truth." Gasps rippled outward as the documents scrolled payments to intermediaries, instructions to intercept correspondence, notes regarding legal pressure and containment strategies. Lady Elizabeth's face drained of color. "This is falsified," she snapped. "A fabrication." Mary stepped forward. "No," she said calmly. "It is corroborated." She held up a final document, the restraining order, stamped and unmistakable. "You were warned," Mary continued. And you ignored it. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Uniformed officers entered, their presence unmistakable. A collective breath was held. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood, the lead officer, announced, "You are under investigation for obstruction, intimidation, and attempted circumvention of a court order." The glass slipped from her hand. For the first time, panic fractured her composure. "This is a misunderstanding," she said sharply. "I am a Blackwood." The officer's expression did not change. "So noted." As they approached, Lady Elizabeth turned desperately toward Arthur. "You will not let them do this," she said. "Everything I did was for you." Arthur met her gaze steady, unmoved. "You did it for yourself," he said. "And now you must answer for it." As she was escorted away beneath the chandelier she had once ruled beneath, the room erupted not in applause, but in stunned realization. The era had ended. Mary did not watch her go. She turned away before the doors closed. Some endings did not deserve an audience. You've watched Mary survive abandonment. Watched her face a duchess in court. Watched justice finally arrive. Now comes the part most people skip. The part that's harder than revenge. Harder than victory. What comes after? Most people leave stories right here, right when it gets real. Right when the question becomes, what does love actually look like when the title doesn't matter anymore? But if you've stayed this long, you're not most people. You're here because you know the best Victorian romances don't end with the villain defeated. They end with two people choosing each other not because of duty, not because of legacy, but because love, real love, is earned slowly. One fence rail at a time. One bowl of porridge. One moment of showing up when it's easier to leave. Stay for this last chapter. It's the one that'll prove why this story matters. The first thing Mary noticed was the silence. Not the brittle, watchful silence of drawing rooms or court chambers, but the honest kind. The sort that settled gently over fields in the early morning, broken only by birdsong and the distant creak of a gate. The cottage sat at the edge of the Chiltern Hills, modest and imperfect, its stone walls softened by ivy and age. It was not grand. It had never been intended to impress. But it held light easily, and warmth lingered even in winter. William and John had claimed the garden within hours of arrival. They ran barefoot through the grass, inventing elaborate games involving fallen branches and imaginary kingdoms, their laughter ringing freely, unburdened by titles or expectations. Mary watched them from the doorway, her arms folded loosely, a faint smile resting on her lips. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. The storm had passed. London, with its gossip and grandeur, felt distant now, as though it belonged to another lifetime entirely. News still arrived, of course. It always did. Letters spoke of inquiries, of estates frozen, of names suddenly spoken in lower tones. Lady Elizabeth Blackwood no longer commanded rooms. Her influence unraveled quickly once exposed. Invitations ceased. Allies withdrew. The grand house grew quiet in ways she had never anticipated. Power, Mary learned, was sustained not by force, but by belief, and belief, once broken, did not return. Arthur arrived 3 weeks after the assembly. He did not come in a carriage. He arrived on foot, dust on his boots, his coat worn plainly, his posture no longer rigid with inherited authority. He stopped at the gate and waited. Mary saw him from the kitchen window. She did not rush. She wiped her hands on a cloth, set it aside, and stepped outside slowly, meeting him where the path curved toward the house. They stood in silence for a long moment. "You came," she said at last. "Yes," Arthur replied. "If you would have me." The humility in his voice was new. Earned. Mary studied him not as the Duke he had been, nor as the boy he once was, but as the man standing before her now. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Arthur exhaled. "I want to be useful," he said. "Not powerful. Not forgiven. Useful." She considered that. "And the boys?" "I want to know them," he said. "On your terms." Slowly. "If they allow it." From the garden came a shout of triumph as John declared himself victor over an imaginary foe. Mary nodded toward the sound. "They are not symbols," she said. "They are children." "I know," Arthur said. "I am learning." That afternoon, he stayed. Not as a guest to be entertained, but as a presence to be earned. He helped William mend a broken fence rail. He listened as John explained, at great length, the rules of a game that made little sense. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He watched. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, Mary and Arthur sat on the steps while the boys chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I thought love was something inherited," Arthur said quietly. "Something granted by approval." Mary looked at him. "Love is chosen," she replied. "Every day." He nodded, the truth settling into him with gentle finality. They did not speak of marriage. Not yet. Some things, Mary knew, could not be rushed without risking fracture. Trust grew slowly, like roots unseen at first, but strong once established. Weeks passed. Then months. The boys began to ask for Arthur by name. They accepted his presence without ceremony, as children do without grandeur or expectation, only consistency. When he came, they welcomed him. When he left, they did not fear abandonment, because he always returned when he said he would. Mary watched it unfold with careful hope. She had learned not to confuse desire with certainty. One afternoon, William tugged at her sleeve as she shelved books in the small study. "Mama," he said thoughtfully. "Is he staying?" Mary knelt to his height. "He is trying," she said. "That is what matters." William considered this. Then nodded solemnly. "That is good," he decided. John added, "He makes good porridge." Mary smiled. But that night, after the boys were asleep, Mary found Arthur sitting on the cottage steps, staring at the stars. She sat beside him. They did not speak for a long moment. "I wrote you 37 letters," Mary said quietly. Arthur's breath caught. "I know," he said. "I found them. In her study. After the trial. She kept them all." Mary's hands tightened in her lap. "I read every one," Arthur continued, his voice breaking. "You told me about the sickness. About being afraid. About the day they were born. About William's first word. About John's fever. About the night you didn't have enough coal for the fire." He turned to her, his face wet. "I missed everything. And I will never forgive myself for that." Mary looked at him, really looked. "You were stolen from us," she said softly. "Just as we were stolen from you." "But I didn't fight," Arthur said hoarsely. "You did." Mary reached for his hand. "You're fighting now," she said. "That's what matters." Arthur bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. "I don't know how to be a father," he whispered. "Neither did I," Mary replied gently. "We'll learn together." And in that moment, beneath stars that had witnessed every letter, every prayer, every year of separation, something finally broke. And something finally healed. Arthur's tears fell silently, years of regret finally finding release. Mary did not pull away. She held his hand tighter, anchoring him to this moment, to this place, to the truth that forgiveness was not a gift given once, but a choice made daily. "They asked about you," Mary said after a while. "When they were younger. I told them you were a man who made a choice. I never told them you didn't know." Arthur looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because I wanted them to respect choices," Mary said. "Even painful ones. I wanted them to understand that life demands decisions, and sometimes we get them wrong." "You protected me," Arthur said, wonder in his voice. "I protected them," Mary corrected gently. "From bitterness. From the poison of hating someone they'd never met." Arthur wiped his face roughly. "I don't deserve that." "Perhaps not," Mary said. "But they do." They sat in silence, the night deepening around them, the cottage warm behind them, the boys safe in their beds. "I brought something," Arthur said finally. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather journal, worn at the edges. "It was my father's," he said. "He wrote in it every day. Thoughts about duty, about legacy, about what it meant to be a Blackwood." He opened it to a page near the end. "But this is what he wrote the year before he died." Mary leaned closer, reading by moonlight. "I built walls to protect what mattered. But I am learning, late, that what matters most cannot be protected by walls at all. It must be chosen. Daily. Imperfectly. And with the humility to admit when we have built the walls around the wrong things." Arthur closed the journal carefully. "I want to choose differently," he said. "If you'll let me." Mary looked at him for a long time. "Every day," she said at last. "That's what it requires." "I know," Arthur said. "Every small moment. Every mended fence. Every bowl of porridge. Every time they fall and need someone to help them up." "I know," he repeated. "It's not dramatic," Mary warned. "It's ordinary. And relentless." Arthur smiled, small, genuine, real. "Good," he said. "I'm done with drama." Mary laughed softly. And for the first time since the night he'd left her 4 years ago, something clicked back into place. Not the same as before. Something new. Something built not on stolen moments and secret kisses, but on honesty, patience, and the slow accumulation of days chosen together. In London, the Blackwood name faded from prominence. Not erased names like that never truly vanished but diminished. Stripped of reverence. Spoken with caution rather than admiration. Arthur did not reclaim it. He declined titles, redirected resources, and accepted a quieter role advising estates rather than ruling them. He learned the value of work unseen, of effort uncelebrated. The cottage expanded slowly, a new room added here, a repaired roof there. Nothing extravagant. Everything intentional. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Arthur stood beside Mary at the hearth. "I once believed my mother's greatest fear was scandal," he said softly. And now? She feared irrelevance, he replied. She could not imagine a world that did not orbit her. Mary stirred the fire. That is the danger of power, she said. It teaches you the wrong lessons. Arthur looked at her, truly looked. And love? He asked. She met his gaze. Love teaches you the right ones, she said. Outside, the rain eased. Inside, the fire burned steadily. They did not need declarations. What survived had proven itself already. Not a title. Not a fortune. Not a legacy enforced by fear. But a family chosen deliberately, imperfectly, and without apology. And in that quiet truth, something far stronger than power endured. Years later, when William and John were grown men with their own questions about legacy and duty, they would find the ivory invitation pressed between the pages of their mother's journal. The invitation meant to humiliate her. Beside it, in Mary's steady hand, 4 words. I chose them instead. Not power. Not title. Not the legacy aristocracy promised would last forever. Just love. Chosen deliberately, earned slowly, and built strong enough to outlast every gilded cage the Duchess ever owned. That was the inheritance that mattered. And in a cottage at the edge of the Chiltern Hills, where laughter still rang through the garden and firelight still warmed the hearth, that inheritance lived on, not in blood or birthright, but in every small, deliberate choice to stay, to show up, to love when it would have been easier to leave. That was the victory no duchess could ever take away. This is the story of how a duchess tried to erase a woman she deemed unworthy and learned too late that some truths refuse to stay buried. And some loves refuse to die.